Hello everyone. Today we want to talk a bit about the lifestyle aspect of the practice, as in how holistic the practice must be overall. How to approach the practice on a level where it really affects every single part of your life. But first, before we dive into the topic in more depth, it's probably a good idea to analyze how people nowadays typically approach the practice overall. It is not rare, at least in more modern traditions, that people typically regard most of the time their formal practice as practice overall, as in the time they spend on the meditation cushion, the time that they spend on their walking path, the time that they spend reading suttas or listening to Dhamma talks. Basically, all of that things from their perspective, with a direct relationship to the Dhamma. That is usually how people approach the practice, and I would argue that that is a kind of limited approach when it comes to Dhamma practice overall. After all, for example, the Noble Eightfold Path has an aspect to it that is called right livelihood, and that is basically, as far as I'm concerned, including basically everything, every aspect of your day-to-day life, the way you conduct yourself in day-to-day living. That is and should be transformed away from craving. So, for example, one holistic approach that you can incorporate rather easily, and which is what I called the very first step in the gradual training, is the keeping of certain rules and precepts. In the case of a lay practitioner, I would say that keeping the 5 precepts would be the most essential thing. But you do not keep the 5 precepts just during certain periods, as in just when you are not killing living beings, or just when you are not stealing, or wrongly conducting yourself sexually, or when you are taking drugs. You want to maintain the precepts. You want to uphold the confinement of the precepts at all times. They protect you in a sense. And you want to make sure that at all times you keep those precepts. And the same applies to all the later steps. But before we dive into that, I think it might be a good idea to have a look or to compare the practice using a simile. And I really like the comparison to a healthy diet. So, for example, you have to eat as a person. No matter how you approach it, you have to maintain your body using food of various different kinds. That food has to contain certain macronutrients, certain micronutrients. And nowadays, people try to create all kinds of magical diet that has to have the aim of losing weight, pretty much. But one of the most core aspects is that they only really want to stick to the diet for a time until they reach their goals, and then they want to abandon the diet. Usually, they return to old habits and regain the weight all over again. So, in that sense, they have taken up the practice of dieting, so to speak, in a conditional sense. They only do it for as long as they have not attained what they were looking for. And once they have attained it, they stop doing it. This is one mistake. And it also applies on the level of Dhamma. So if you have a look at the Dhamma practice of a certain practitioner, they might practice to reach what they think of the first jhana, really put forth effort, try to apply their mind, try to learn everything about it. And once they reach whatever they have attained at the time, or whatever it is they have truly attained, then they pretty much stop and either maintain that state or repeat it all over again, or they simply stop. That might be one way. Yet another way in which a diet is a useful comparison is the holisticness of it all. So, as an example, people try to pinpoint certain food items that are unhealthy or leading to an unhealthy diet that are problematic. Like in the past, people blamed fats. I think that happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s or something, when people decided that having dietary fat or too much dietary fat is a problem. Nowadays, people are usually blaming sugar or things like that. If a diet has too much sugar, then it is problematic, very unhealthy, and it should be avoided. Or nowadays, people learn, and they have found out through various scientific approaches or empirical approaches, as in observing what other people were doing and if it was working or not, that those things were not to blame. So they are looking for the next culprit. And the next thing might be that you are looking for unprocessed food items or whole, what's it called in English? organic, organic foods, things that have been healthily grown, etc. And all those things should certainly do play a certain role in a healthy diet. I don't want to question that. But all of that is still missing the big picture. And the big picture in the case of a diet would be how much you're eating. Overall, are you having too much or the right amount or even a bit less than what you're needing? And when you miss that, no matter what diet you are participating in, no matter what diet you're following, you will miss the mark to some degree at least. It might work for a time, but after a certain time it will stop working, since the problem has been misdiagnosed. In this case, the healthiness of a diet mainly boils down, from my humble opinion, to the amounts that you're eating. As an example, when you are following a standard Western diet, an American diet, where you eat fast food most of the time, if you then start to eat a broccoli in addition to that, or some other kind of healthy food item, then it will not make a positive difference. You are still eating a diet of junk food. If the problem was missing broccoli, then you would fix it. No question about it. But in most cases, that was not the problem to begin with. The problem is that you're eating too much. And now you're eating even more, even though the extra stuff that you're eating is broccoli. If you're just adding it on top, then it won't fix the problem at all. And this is one of the core principles. And in the same way, you can compare that with an approach to the Dhamma practice. When you are practicing in a way that excludes certain parts of your life, then you have, on the highest level, not recognized craving for what it is. And craving, even in the case of a healthy diet, is fundamentally what is unhealthy. You are overeating because you are craving food, as an example. If you were not craving food or eating or tasting, sense experience through the tongue, as an example, or through texture in the mouth and all those things, then there would be no reason to overeat at all. So in that case, even in the very mundane cases, craving is a problem. Craving is fundamentally to blame when it comes to all those things. And this is what most people miss. When you only practice at certain times, then you are still missing that craving. You are allowing that craving to infest your entire experience at all other times. Even in the case of keeping the precepts. And most of the time, you are not taking drugs, even if you are a party person, as an example, unless you are severely addicted and living in the streets. Most of the time, you are not committing sexual misconduct or sleeping with other people. Most of the time, you are very likely, even as one of the most immoral persons on earth, most of the time you are not lying. And most of the time you are not stealing. At least most of the time you are not spending actual time stealing or killing. Yet, obviously, a person who does that on some occasions is not to be considered a virtuous person. So whatever you do, your practice has to take place on a level that includes everything, and that has to take everything into account. Every possible part of your experience has to be purified from greed, aversion, and delusion. This is one of the key principles of the Dhamma practice. Otherwise, the self will always find a place to re-establish. There's always a higher layer, so to speak, from which you are now controlling and manipulating your experience, from which you are basically ignoring the three marks of your existence. And this is the key message of the video today. Whatever practice you do, it has to transform your entire life. You cannot really separate your conduct, the way you live your life, from the Dhamma practice. If you really understand something about the practice, then it has to have an effect on everything that you are doing. As an example, when you truly are intent on renunciation, then you cannot maintain a lifestyle of sensuality the same way as before. If you are truly intent on giving things up on every level, on reducing your dependence on sense experience, then life has to get simpler overall. And this simplicity has to affect every part of your existence. And it cannot really leave anything out. If you are still, I don't know, heavily engaging in drugs on the weekend, then you are still craving that. Very, very likely. I cannot think of any reasonable situation, as an example, where a person who is intent on renunciation indulges in taking drugs once in a while with friends or something like that. It's simply incompatible. You cannot accumulate sense experience or accumulate sensual depth and at the same time give it up. Those things are mutually exclusive. And your lifestyle kind of has to reflect that. You cannot separate your wisdom when it comes to sense experience, and that it is actually painful, that craving is not something to go for, that craving should be avoided. You want to learn that it's actually like a burning charcoal pit, so to speak, and at the same time engage in it. That's not something that you can do. You cannot touch the hot stove knowing that it is hot. In the same way, your mind will not go there. It cannot go there anymore. It becomes impossible to consider sensual lust, as an example, as something good, as a relief from the pressure, as an example, that bad feelings might exert on you. And as a result, you kind of drop everything that has to do with it, even though that you still might have blind spots where you do not see it as such. And due to that ignorance, you cannot uproot that yet. And that would be problematic and something to work on. And this is basically the work of a Sotapanna, where he has to uncover all those things and remove all their blind spots, even though they have understood the principle on how to do that. And this is kind of it. You have to really make sure that the entirety of your experience is transformed away from craving. Otherwise, all those underlying tendencies, all those views, all those sensual views are still there. They are just waiting and festering in the background. And those views, those values, are typically unseen. Our underlying tendencies are, by definition, invisible to us. So we kind of have to uncover them by really tightening the restraint, by really increasing the confinement around the mind. If you really disallow the mind from ever experiencing sense pleasures again, then through that kind of severe restraint that affects every area of your life, you will experience the suffering that results from that. You start paying back the sensual debt that you have accumulated before through repeated dependence, cultivating the dependence on sense experience. This is more or less it. And once you start paying it back, then you really feel the weight of it all. Then the mind is truly cornered, and then it will be confronted with suffering. And then it's not just the feelings that you are manipulating in a sense where you try to make your experience more comfortable, as you have taken away that wind from the mind. It can no longer relish the idea of indulging it in itself in the future, as an example, to get rid of accumulated pressure or something like that. When you truly have closed off all the leaks, so to speak, in a bottle, then the pressure has nowhere to go and you kind of have to deal with it. That is probably a good metaphor to think about it. But as long as there are some vices left, as long as there is something, craving can just re-establish itself. Then you can blow off steam, so to speak, through one of the remaining holes. So they truly have to, all of those holes kind of have to be sealed. Otherwise, it will not really help. Otherwise, I've said that in multiple videos in the past, craving will just find a new target. So it really is important that whatever kind of practice you do, it has to affect all areas of your life. If it is not, then you can be absolutely certain that craving will just establish itself in some new way that will be undetectable, at least without help by you. So you really have to make sure that all those vices, all those leaks, so to speak, are closed. And this requires a good amount of investigation on your end to really find out where you are still indulging. Because the mind can truly indulge in all kinds of things. There are no limits when it comes to clinging and craving, what the mind can and cannot do. It can basically cling to everything, even to the idea of being or existing on those subtle levels. But at this point here, those things are not really concerning ourselves. But anyway, I think that should be enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy what we do here, feel free to like, subscribe, and maybe join the Discord hub, the Dhamma hub server, our Discord server. And if you have further questions, you can ask the community there. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.